Hey programmers, today I want to make sure that the first time you rock up to a grandMA3 with your grandMA2 show file, you're gonna look like you've been doing it forever. I'm Kat West. I'm the Consoletrainer for this Consoletrainer channel. If you like this video, please hit like. If you want more tutorials, hit subscribe. And if you have some questions that I don't cover in this video, please leave them in the comments below. Okay, right away, let's just assume that you've just pulled the grandMA3 out of its road case. First off, we got to pull out both of these transport locks. These locks do need to be in for a transpo in the case, so remember to put them back in before you pack them up. Now we can pull up the screens, and there's no need to hold down MA or any other buttons while we do this. Next, let's look at the back panel. Just after the desk light connection, we've got our PowerCon cable connector and the power toggle, which I'll turn on now. There's 6 DMX outs and 1 DMX in. We've got 2 display ports for your external monitors, and underneath those are MIDI in and outs. And then we've got our SMPTE port for timecode, and then 2 different kinds of USB ports. The top is USB 3 and the lower are USB 2. And before you ask, yep, there are USB ports on the front as well. We've got some audio remote ins and a DC remote in, which is actually a smaller port than it was on the MA2. There's 3 Ethernet connectors. The first port corresponds to the first on the MA2, and the second to the second port on the MA2. So if you've got any ArtNet, that's going to go in here. And the third isn't going to do anything for us at all in grandMA2 mode. The other ports we can ignore in MA2 mode are these SPDIF outs. They're only for use in MA3. Okay, we've got everything connected and our power toggle is on in the back, so let's hit this button in the top right corner of our front panel to turn the console on and boot it up. After a couple of seconds, you're going to see a screen that lets you pick which mode you want to boot up in, 2 or 3. If the MA2 is highlighted, you're good to go. If not, just touch it. By the way, if you come up to a grandMA3 that's already running in 3 mode, you don't have to go through a whole power cycle to switch to 2. Just type restart please on your command line. This command line also works in the grandMA2 side if you want to switch to 3 mode. Next, we're going to go through how we can use the front panel in MA2 mode, but first let's talk about all of the buttons and knobs that you can ignore because they only function in MA3 mode. You can ignore the executor knobs for each of the main playback faders and the 2 above the master section, along with the 2 buttons directly underneath these knobs. Same goes for the knobs underneath what would be our multi-touch screen. Really, the only knob you're going to get anything out of is this one in the upper right. It will roll your grandmaster up and down, and if you press on it, it's a blackout button. I'm obviously using a light, but if you have a full-size MA3, then you'll have what they call the custom section. In MA2 mode, you can ignore the top half of this. These keys and encoders aren't going to help us at all on the 2 side. Okay, let's load our show and talk about what we can do on the front panel. First off, we can plug in our USB either underneath the armrest, or if you pull out the keyboard drawer, there's another port inside, which is especially handy for those times when you want to forget your USB key when you leave. Once your USB key is in, we hit the first weird thing about this hardware. Where's the backup key? Well, in MA2 mode, there's going to be a couple of on-screen places you can use to access this menu. We've got on-screen buttons for tools, setup, and backup at the bottom of the right touchscreen. You can also hit the menu hard key at any time. While that does immediately bring up the setup menu will also always show tools, setup, and backup at the top. Once in the backup menu, it should start feeling pretty familiar. And I'm definitely going to talk more about the on-screen software differences just as soon as we finish talking about the hardware on the front panel. For playback, your executors still have 1 button below and 2 buttons above that line up with the 2. The bottom line of keys are your MA2 executor buttons. The faders will light up with any colors that you've assigned to what's on your executor. If you're on a full-size MA3, the programmer and executor time faders now map to the wheels in the custom section, and the 2 buttons below these wheels enable and disable the functions. If you're not on a full size, you can always access these using the GUI on the right letterbox. To the right of the executors are the main playbacks and the 2 faders that correspond to these, along with the go, go back, and pause keys. Below what we'd call the multi-touch screen in grandMA2 are 16 X keys. And you might be saying, Cat, 16? Weren't there 20 on the MA2? Yeah, there were. So since the key count is smaller, the keys that would have been our center X keys will show with a light gray background on screen, and it can be a bummer. Command lines and macros and cues will still trigger any sequences you have on them, but if you're used to hitting a key to trigger these, you might consider moving some stuff around. There is an option to make these buttons invisible, and we'll come back to that when we get into the software side of this tutorial. On the far right side of the console is your dimmer wheel. With the exception of the numeric keypad, the rest of the keys on the MA3 really aren't set up like the MA2 at all. MA has kindly added a GUI on the right command screen that more or less lines up with some of the key layout on the 2. Setup, tools, and backup are not here, but remember, they're always on the right touchscreen. I will say that everything that shows up on that screen does exist as a hard key somewhere on the MA3, but some of them aren't immediately obvious. If you want to start working on your MA3 muscle memory and not rely on that screen so much, here are a couple of tips. Instead of using the user 1 and 2 and list buttons to change what shows up on your X keys, use the X keys button to toggle you through user 1 and 2, and below that you'll find the list key. Under the left side command screen, there are a couple of keys that are listed as secondary on some of the X keys and the playback function keys below it. Holding MA and pressing one of those keys will put that lower keyword on your command line. Some are only for MA3 like grid and link, but he will tell you that X13, which shows phaser, will actually turn into the effect key on the MA2 software. And some key presses are exactly the same. For example, holding MA and at will still give you stomp. And you may have noticed there are 2 MA keys now, so you can use either. Another thing that tracks on the MA3 hardware is that you can still use the pause key on the keyboard to lock your desk. There's no trackball, so on the right command screen, click Trackpad, and you can use this screen for both mouse and positioning. Hit keys when you want to go back to that MA2 button layout. There's no Grandmaster fader. It shows up on the letterbox screen far right, and like I said, we can use that rotary underneath it to roll it up and down or push it in to act as a blackout key. For our encoders, we've got the first 4 for our attributes and editing, and the 5th is a screens encoder, just like MA2. But what's new here is that you've got inner and outer wheels. On the screen encoder, the inner wheel is our normal scroller, but outer will scroll us faster. And you can still hold down the inner wheel if we want to go left or right within a sheet. The little round encoder key underneath this 5th encoder is going to line up with that target key on the MA2, so when you hold it down, you'll get the same options on your screen. On our attribute encoders, the inner encoder is our regular speed, and the outer encoder is going to run it faster. The round button just below toggles your encoder modes through normal, fine, and ultrafine. If you want to bring up the calculator, click the inner encoder. And while we're looking here, check out this bonus network status info section on the left side of this letterbox screen. You might have noticed that I'm not referring to any of the screens by their number. Screen-wise, the MA3 numbering is a little bit different than the 2, and since I'm just never going to remember these numbers, I'm going to keep referring to the screens by their type, whether it's a touch screen, letterbox, or command screen, and then just their location, like left, right, or middle. We've already started looking at this. Obviously, MA has moved the button sections of the 2 touchscreens to the letterbox screens below. So our attributes and features are right next to our encoders, and our playbacks are right above our executors. Since they've moved these sections down, the free pixels on the touchscreens are now assigned to other windows that are just nice to have, like command line. Also, on the right screen, we already saw that they added 3 hardware keys that were always together on the 2: tools, setup, and backup. Remember that these are also present at the top of each of the setup, backup, and tools windows. The center touch screen, which is the left touch screen on my light, has page up and down controls and a macro pool, which is also available on the far left screen in the full size. If you want to change which macros show up here, we need to go into the setup window. You can either use the on-screen button or hit the menu key. Under User, find grandMA3 settings. To change where the macros start from, change the offset here. If you don't want to see the macros on screen, just turn off the additional macro buttons. This option allows you to say if you want the macros to swap as you change surfaces or not. And if you don't like the backlights on the encoders or the faders, you can turn them off here. Then we've got options for those missing X keys. Remember how the ones that didn't have a hard key match showed up in gray? If you don't want those 4 buttons to show up at all, you can set them to hidden and they'll disappear. The benefit is that the remaining keys will line up on the screen nicely with their X key mates, but if you're like me, you probably want to leave them in gray so you can access what you stored there. For the missing X keys and dialogues option, I really recommend leaving this gray, because if you set it to hidden, there will be options in some of your windows like update or assign that just won't show up. And if you turn off playback function keys, you just disable the playback keys underneath the X keys. And that's our quick start for running your grandMA2 show file on a grandMA3 like a Rockstar. If you've got a request for a video topic that you'd like to see me make, please leave it in the comments below. I've gotten some really nice requests from you guys over the last couple of weeks, and the more you tell me what you want, the more I'll make. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.